Hi everyone, my name is Alex O'Connor. I'm from Trinity College, Dublin, and I wear multiple hats, but my principal one is CNGL, but I also work with the Sundari and Cultura projects in digital humanities. I'm going to speak about multilingual standards and practices in the digital humanities. And I'm going to start by being a bit of a coward and saying this is my view as a computer scientist of digital humanities, which is typically an arts domain. So ex-historians such as Charles, who may want to throw things at me for what I say, or any stereotypes that I make, I would apologize for in advance, or possibly not. Defining the humanities is a big thing. So it's a kind of a natural sense in one context, in that in Ireland and in the UK in particular, there is this clear division between the science people, the engineers, and the arts people. So arts people are typically studying things like language, they're typically studying history, law, those sorts of things. Whereas social science kind of fits in the middle, it's halfway between. They're doing analysis of things like economics kind of fits in there, and the classic social sciences. And then we have actual science in that sense, which you might think of as the real scientists, the chemists, the physicists, and so on. That arguably is something that is only a reflection of the way language defines the way we structure our thinking, because the German terms for the Wissenschaft is used in both cases. So there isn't a situation where they have this distinction of humanities. So the second question that always comes up on the other side is, what is digital humanities? And the classic example here is the question of, is it digital humanities because I went to JSTOR, downloaded a bunch of documents in PDF, wrote it on the web, and submitted it as a Word document to my journal editor? Well, probably not. What we're thinking about here is the notion that we're actually talking about a humanities inquiry that is enabled in a way by the digital artifacts that could not be done manually, or could only be done manually over an extraordinarily long period. So there's a key transitional difference in what we're trying to represent in digital humanities. There's a methodological merging between computer science in particular, information science, and humanistic inquiry, which is about providing this human interpretive context upon it. So it's about the capture and creation, it's about analysis, interpretation, storage, and dissemination. And I have a couple of links there. These slides are online, by the way, at the URL. I'll post it again later. But I've tried to link these things so that you can think about what humanities computing might mean and what these debates actually mean within the community, because it is much more important than you might think to consider that fact. Some of the key topic areas right now that you might be interested in to see as what are actual digital humanities as a sub-community, if you like, thinking about. Well, the top topics from Scott Weinkart's analysis of the main conference DH 2014, they were looking in text analysis, which is things like topic modeling. This is this idea that I would look at 1,200 documents, so that rather than drawing the conclusions about 19th century literature from having read Hardy and having read 3 or 4 authors in depth, that I would be able to do a topic model across the whole statistical, all the writers. Ooh. Literary analysis then is, literary analysis, I'll become more civilized. Literary analysis, this notion of distance reading is what this comes from. There's a famous situation where a professor in English literature set his first year students, a reading list of 1,200 books to read, which is even unreasonable to literary students who like reading. But in fact, the objective was not for him to read that, but for them to perform a statistical analysis on that, a latent semantic index or a latent Dirichlet allocation, and to see what came out. And this can provide some very interesting learning when it is taken in the context of analysis. The third thing is archives and repositories. So these are these notions of these huge numbers of memory institutions that exist throughout, particularly Europe, but all around the world, which hold extraordinary treasures, all of them locked away in shoeboxes. How do they get found? How do they get discovered? How do they get opened? There's an extraordinary quantity of stuff there. Data and text mining then is even more in these sorts of things. And one of the fascinating things here is that Roberto, or Father Busa as he is known, one of the earliest digital humanists, a lot of what they were doing was actually things that had been done by hand over 20 years. So things like analyzing every use of a particular verb in the Bible, and then codifying that. And those sorts of things, those concordances as they were called, were done by hand by scholars. So the humanist scholars are not afraid of going through an extraordinary amount of detail like that. And then there are things like visualization. So, for example, the neatline tool, which allows you to visualize the order of battles in the American Civil War. What are the digital artifacts that we're looking at here? Well, the key ones are the things that you might think about. Things like manuscripts, codexes, and so on. Books, film is a huge area of interest. An example here is that the First World War propaganda movies are an extremely interesting area because you see things like the connection of different types of movie filming. So actual footage from battles, actual footage filmed on the battlefield after the battle, and things filmed in the south of Yorkshire which were supposed to represent Passchendaele or whatever. And all of those three things can be in the same film reel, and distinguishing those different three things and making it clear to people which is the true real part and which isn't is the sort of thing that can be very interesting in film. Personal diaries, personal letters, those are enormously important. Archaeological finds, and more importantly, and very importantly, increasingly, is the question of secondary sources, journalistic sources, and accounts that people have written in the past already. A lot of what we think about when we think about the way we look at history is actually through the interpretation of someone like Bede or someone like that who has already been through this for us. One of the key questions that then arises is, what is the original digital artifact? For example, with a document, is it the image of the document? Is it the manual transcription of this document? Is it the normalized and processed HTML text that we have on the web? Or is it the knowledge in the text, the metadata describing the people, places, and entities? All of these things, from one sense or another, are that digital artifact. They're all, in one sense, something of that fundamental quality of the knowledge in that thing. And the question is, what are they? And there's some fascinating sensitivities. So, for example, with the normalized and processed text, there's a great worry that that would become the one that people would use because it's the one they can read most easily. And then you lose some quintessential fact because you've actually lost that variation in spelling. What are you marking up as well? So one of the interesting things that I discovered, or not discovered, but was taught about in the process of learning about digital humanities is the difference between a library and an archive. And the key thing here is that a library stores things for individual retrieval. So it is that thing of you wanting to get a book. An archive is a collection. They are a repository for primary sources and collections thereof. And those collections can be enormous. There can be thousands of boxes of thousands of documents, none of which have been opened since 1914, all of which may have something interesting in them, but are written on paper that was produced during the First World War, for example, which may not be very high quality, which may be highly faded. So one of the interesting and fascinating things is the notion that there is a lot of content out there that will never realistically be digitized. So we have to be able to deal with that, to deal with the fact that all you get is those footprints. And why you're marking things up is also quite different to what things are. It's not the standard categorical markup that you might be used to. You may not be able to mark up in the way you're used to. One of the classic problems in the medieval work is that Mr. Anonymous turns out to have written a surprising amount of things. And that's because there is no author, because the concept of authorship wasn't there. In the Sendari project, we're looking in particular at this notion of hidden archives and secondary works, existing databases, and allowing scholars to bring data and access the physical and decide if they need things. And Sendari taught me about why it's important to know about this notion of what they call an archive research guide or archive catalogue and research guide. And this is about this idea that the assumption is not that you will find the data on the web, that you will solve your humanistic problem on the web. Instead, what it will tell you is whether or not you need to now travel to Serbia or to Montenegro to ask the librarian there if you can open one of those shoeboxes full of content. So these archive research guides are about unifying digital and humanities in the service of this humanistic inquiry. They allow you to expose things like visualizations, annotations, entity analysis, where those things are available, but also list those physical resources that don't exist on the web, as I said. And we're working to edit those right now in MediaWiki, in fact. So these notions of entities are a big thing. One of the interesting questions that we have is this idea of notability in the context of crowdsourcing. So a huge thing that's coming up right now, as you're probably most of you are aware, it is the century anniversary of the First World War. And there is a huge amount of work going on at the moment to transcribe, annotate, and crowdsource vast numbers of records. All of the minor units, military units, letters from people, every record of every soldier in the UK will be online. Each of those people is going to need some sort of a reference that we can use to reference them. There's a DBpedia or a Wikipedia data page for every general in the First World War, but there isn't one for every soldier in the First World War, and arguably there shouldn't be. So there's a really interesting challenge there. And we're looking at things like some of the key ontologies and knowledge that are out there already, such as the VIAF, which allows you to look at information about authors, the EDM, which is the Europeana data model, and BibFrame, which is also a structure from the Open Library Consortium. The other question that we find very interesting is the feasibility of automation in archaic languages and language forms and in highly irregular content. 15th century people didn't have spell checkers. In fact, they didn't have regularized spelling. So the point is that the words that you're looking for, the stretching of characters that Richard was mentioning, those sorts of things are all there. Documents switch scripts in the middle of them. They will change. Documents may not even be. They can be these things where people have pasted together a bunch of different stuff. So the incredible richness, and I think one of the key things for the multilingual web community to consider about this is these are some of the most interesting edge cases that you can possibly imagine for what constitutes a document that needs to be offered in a multilingual fashion to multiple communities in different contexts. Because these are things that are incredibly complicated if you understand them well. So a very simple example of this is that there's a city in Poland called Gdansk, or Danzig auf Deutsch. Some of the names that it's had over the years, the Civitas Danzig, the Vicus Teutonicus, whose it belonged to over the years, the Kingdom of Poland and so on. If the document that you search for, if you're interested in engagements in Gdansk, and the document has been marked up by an archive in Poland, they will have marked it up using the modern names. There's no guarantee that that's how it will have been marked up by other people as well. So you have this problem that not only is there a contextual challenge in the content, there's a contextual challenge in the metadata, because let's be fair and perfectly honest, metadata markup like this, particularly in recent history, is a political and cultural issue, and one that is closely associated with national identity. So there are some standards that you might be interested in to have a look at. One of them is the OAI PMH, which is the Open Archives Initiative Protocol for Metadata Harvesting. As I mentioned, not all of these people are going to be offering their full text, some because they don't want to, some because they don't feel they should, and some because it doesn't exist. But you can harvest metadata from archives and look at updates from that. There's the MOD standard, which is related to, again, describing manuscripts and documents and those sorts of things. And the text encoding initiative, which allows you to look at a lot of the different types of markup that I mentioned, these things that are not the standard types of markup that you might see, forgive me, in schema.org, but are things like how you organize the different pages, catchword pages in a codex, or the degree to which a particular piece of content is imaginative, or editorial revisions, or all sorts of things which you would never have considered as possible, and where musical notation comes in as well, for example, in here. And there are some very interesting guidelines, very interesting structures as to how different humanistic inquiry comes in. The other thing is that this is not new. There's been a huge amount of digitization going on already and encoding, and they adopted XML with extraordinary enthusiasm early on. So there are lots of old relax NGs and DTDs out there which need to be updated. Language is an incredibly complex question. Documents can mix content, they can mix script, they can mix language. That when I talk about language, that may not be something that is true. For example, we were looking at some relatively recent Italian documentation, and someone explained to us, this is not going to work with any of your tools that use general modern Italian because it's written in effectively a dialect. If it's going to be written by someone who is writing a letter to their friends and they're from this very deep south of Germany, that's different as well. Finally, sorry, I'll go over the research landscape very briefly, which is to say that there is all of this association, these sorts of things that you might wish to look at. So thank you very much indeed for your attention. This research is sponsored by CNGL, and I hope you can take a chance to have a look at the links on the page. And if anyone has any interest to talk to me, please do come to.